200,000 on the streets and 2 by-elections on the same day, which really hammered the government, hammered the water charges, hammered all those that weren't strong enough in opposing water charges. Then up to 200,000 on the streets a couple of weeks later, and one of the biggest protests perhaps in 30 years since the tax marches. And I think most importantly in terms of people rising, it's actually stuff like this. It's self-organisation, self-mobilisation of communities all across the country. I mean, tonight there's probably 20 meetings like this or more happening all across Dublin. Last night I did one in Selbridge. The night before I did 4 meetings in one night in Tala. There's another meeting, there's 2 meetings in Tala tonight. There's just a huge amount of flowering of communities coming together and experiencing their own power and getting organised to fight and beat this government and to beat the water charges. And the result is that the so-called great people do not look great anymore. They look absolutely terrified. Whether you see them in the Dáil, or whether you see them in Walkinstown, or whether you see them in Limerick, or wherever it is that we see them, they're terrified because they're facing what is increasingly arisen people, people who have had enough and are experiencing now their own power. And the result is that we're winning. Right? That's a very, very important point. That we've had 6 years of defeats, often defeats with no battles whatsoever, because the trade union leaders who were meant to lead did the opposite of that and they sold people out. And the Labour Party that people thought represented them completely betrayed people. Whereas now we're on the road to a very, very important victory, I think. It's not guaranteed yet. And the result is that the government is scared, and we have to be aware that they're not just going to roll over and accept defeat, but they're going to try and fight back. And in particular, they're going to try and divide the movement against water charges. And what they're using at the moment, in particular in the last couple of weeks, is a big stick and a tiny baby carrot. And the big stick is composed of the threats to jail people that we saw in the court cases the other day, with a 6-month suspended sentence now hanging over people for a 28-day jail sentence. So it hangs over them for 6 months to try and make them be well behaved, as in not go 20 metres within water meter installation, regardless of how peaceful they're being. The use of Gardaí at water meter protests. Today in Templeogue, they played a very dirty role where they worked with Irish Water, with Farrans who were imposing the water meters, where they told the protesters, us, that trucks were going to leave the area, wouldn't be coming back, and then they escorted them around in another entrance and came back up. So a very, very dirty role played by the Gardaí in many different parts of the city. And in particular, a horrendous, massive media campaign of distortion, of demonisation, of an entire community, of Walkinstown, but in particular of protesters in general, all designed to appeal to reasonable people and to think that there's violent protesters out there, like the people in Walkinstown, like me, obviously connected to ISIS, according to Noel Coonan in the Dáil, accused of being a kidnapper by the Taoiseach in the Dáil, accused of being a ringleader by Joan Burton in the Dáil. But it's the demonisation of what was, in its essence, a peaceful protest of hundreds of people who were extremely angry and had every right to be angry. And it's Joan Burton who has a cheek in thinking that should be given a red carpet when she goes into a community like Walkinstown that has been devastated not just by the water charges, not just by the property tax, but by the child benefit cuts, by the rent allowance cuts, by the heaping of misery onto ordinary people. People are understandably extremely angry and express that. And so then you have they thought they had a golden opportunity to really do us in as a campaign and to intimidate people away from participating in the protest on December the 10th. And I think one thing that's very interesting is that a lot of people now have seen through the role of the media and seen through the role of independent newspapers in particular, right, which is playing the same inglorious role that it's played for over 100 years. Where in 1913, William Martin Murphy, then the owner of independent newspapers, was the leader of the bosses in terms of the lockout and used the newspapers to demonise those workers. In 1916, we were the first outlet to call for the execution of James Connolly, or you can go back much more recently to the role that independent newspapers then played when owned by Tony O'Reilly, who had oil and gas interests, then talking about the Rossport protesters, the Shell to Sea protesters, about being a sinister fringe, about being dissidents. They hadn't come up with the ISIS thing at that stage. ISIS hadn't been invented at that stage, so they couldn't use that. But exactly the same kind of lines used against protesters. And now it's about Dennis O'Brien protecting the interests of the establishment as a whole, trying to prevent the mob, as in the mass of ordinary people feeling their own power, but also protecting his own economic interests in making a profit from the imposition of water meters and probably with an eye to privatisation of water in the future. That's the big stick, and then the baby carrot is what they wheeled out last week in terms of a week and a half ago, the tiny concessions that they gave. I don't think people have bought out of it, because people understand, even if people didn't understand when they went to their first protest, but they do now, that this is about the principle of the thing. That if water charges are introduced at any level, then if water is being commodified, something that's been a human right is no longer a human right, it's bought and sold for profit, you have flat rate charges for 4 years, which means it's a completely regressive home tax, where a multimillionaire pays the same as an unemployed person or a low paid worker. For 4 years you have that, and after that you're back to metered charges, an average of €200 per adult. So €200 per year for one adult, 400 for two, 600. So huge charges that will simply go up, and privatisation will follow regardless of what promises they make. But I think people understand that, and I think what they've tried to do hasn't worked in the past while, either the demonisation or the tiny carrot. It's all designed to split off some people from the protest, understanding that a hardcore would be that. The other point is precisely that they're not done yet. They're going to crank up the fear-mongering, crank up the scaremongering, crank up this campaign of propaganda and intimidation against people. That's the weapon that they have against people. And the weapon that we have against them is confidence, is hope of ordinary people, and that only comes about through organisation. It comes about through more people getting involved actively in helping out here, in giving out leaflets, in organising meetings, in speaking at meetings. It comes through people becoming active themselves in their own communities, giving out leaflets, being a leaflet network, going door to door, talking to people. That's the only way that we spread the message of people, is getting all the activists to go and talk to other people who are wavering, who are considering going into demonstration, who are thinking about paying or not paying. We have to get people really, really actively organised, and that's how we'll be able to stand up against their scaremongering. Concretely, about water metering, potentially coming quite soon. I think you should prepare for, it's up to people here obviously, but prepare to try to organise significant, peaceful, effective protests of the community. There's no point in shipping people in from the outside to do it. It has to come from the community, otherwise there's no basis for it. But there's an argument to go and talk to people, try and discuss with people, try and prepare for people to come out and protest in whatever effective way that people can. Secondly is December the 10th. I just think it's hugely, hugely significant. Never before, or certainly in a long time, has any protest been as widely expected and the numbers talked about on both sides, by the government, by the media, and by protesters. We have to ensure that it's absolutely massive protest, and in doing so, that there's an element of an unofficial half-day general strike or full-day general strike, of people taking the day off work, go and sit, if they're organised in a union, taking a long lunch and not coming back afterwards, whatever way people can to ensure they're there, 1 o'clock at the Dáil, and then whatever feeder marches that people are participating in. It's very, very important. If we have 50,000 people, it's a massive show to the government that all their tactics haven't worked, they have no credibility on this issue. If we have a thing that we need to prepare for is the boycott. Because when the bills are now coming in April, and if we haven't scrapped the water charges and got rid of the government by then, the boycott is the way to do it. A massive, organised boycott building towards 50% non-payment. It'll show there's no basis for these charges whatsoever, but it'll also show there's no basis for this government whatsoever. And I think people are correct to think in terms of beating the water charges, but also bringing this government down through people power. And that's the last point I'd make, is like, why is the establishment so scared about this movement? It's only water charges. It's only €160 or €260 minus the €100. Why are they so scared? Why, in the last issue of the Sunday Independent, were there 11 articles attacking the anti-water charges movement? And the reason is because when Enda Kenny says there's a sinister agenda at work here, it's not just about water charges. Actually, he's right. There's nothing sinister about it, but that people have used the issue of water charges to fight back against 6 years of cuts of extra taxes, against bailing out banks, against bailing out bondholders, and against running society in the interests of people like Dennis O'Brien, those people, the elite, the 1% in our society, dominating Ireland, dominating Europe. It's about all of those things. And the problem that they have, the reason they talk about a mob, is because they know that once we win on the water charges, we're not going to be satisfied. We're going to say, let's use the same tactics to fight on the housing crisis, to say to reclaim our oil and gas, natural resources, to say to tackle the problems in healthcare and education for public investment, etc. But also, people are going to say, if we can have people power from below, and if we can get rid of these charges, well then, could we get rid of
the way society is organised. Could we argue for a fundamentally different way of organising society? A society run in the interest of the 99% of working class people, as opposed to Dennis O'Brien, bankers and bondholders, the kind of society that Larkin and Connolly were fighting for.